Solomon Islands, November 13, 1942, 0200 hours, and Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamada stood on the bridge of destroyer Naganami, watching his lookouts scan the darkness of the slot as they shepherded 4 transport barges loaded with rice and ammunition toward Guadalcanal, completely unaware that 15 miles away a matte black-painted American PBY-5A Catalina was tracking every movement of his convoy on its ASV Mark II radar screen, the phosphorescent green blips marking his ships for death in waters the Japanese had ruled since August. The radar operator aboard the Catalina, painted so black it seemed to absorb the moonlight itself, watched the returns from his Yagi antennae mounted under the wings. The 1.7-meter wavelength pulses at 214 megahertz painting a perfect picture of the Japanese formation at a range the enemy couldn't even imagine, while Yamada's lookouts strained their eyes into darkness that revealed nothing, trusting in the night that had protected the Tokyo Express for months. The Americans called these converted patrol bombers Black Cats, a name officially adopted on October 30, 1942, though the Japanese wouldn't learn the designation until captured documents revealed it months later, by which time hundreds of their supply barges and dozens of destroyers had already gone to the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. Victims of an electronic eye they couldn't detect, couldn't counter, and couldn't escape. The Catalina's pilot, Lieutenant William Mason of VP-11, reduced his twin Pratt and Whitney engines to near idle, the technique Black Cat crews had perfected to mask their approach, while his radar operator called out course corrections that would bring them directly over the Japanese convoy, and in the nose compartment, the bombardier prepared his load of 4 500-pound bombs, knowing that Yamada's ships below had no radar, no warning receivers, nothing but human eyes and ears to detect the 100-foot wingspan of death gliding toward them at 2,000 feet. The Japanese had dismissed radar technology when their German allies had offered to share it in 1941, with naval planners in Tokyo believing their superior night vision training and binoculars would always triumph over electronic gadgets. A decision that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto would later privately curse as he read report after report of supply convoys simply vanishing in the night, their last radio transmissions cut off mid-sentence as American bombs found them in absolute darkness. Radio Tokyo had begun inventing explanations for the mounting losses by December 1942, broadcasting claims of new American superplanes that surpassed anything known in speed and maneuverability, desperate propaganda to explain why their convoys were being devastated by what were actually the slowest, most ungainly aircraft in the American inventory, lumbering flying boats that cruised at barely 125 miles per hour but carried an electronic advantage the Japanese couldn't even comprehend. Yamada had made this run 7 times before, part of what the Americans called the Tokyo Express and the Japanese themselves termed rat transportation, Nezumi Yuso, because these operations only moved at night, scurrying through the darkness to avoid the American aircraft at Henderson Field that ruled the daylight hours over the slot, that body of water between the parallel chains of the Solomon Islands that had become a graveyard for both navies since August. The supply situation on Guadalcanal had grown desperate by November 1942, with General Hyakutake's 17th Army losing 50 men per day to starvation and disease, forcing the Imperial Navy to risk its valuable destroyers as glorified cargo vessels. Each ship carrying drums of rice and medical supplies instead of torpedoes, their crews bitter about being reduced to running groceries, while the Americans grew stronger every day. Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, commanding the 2nd Destroyer Squadron and the mastermind of these nocturnal supply runs, had perfected the technique of racing down the slot at 30 knots, arriving at Guadalcanal near midnight, throwing supplies overboard in waterproof drums, and racing back north before dawn brought the inevitable attacks from Henderson Field, but even Tanaka's tactical genius couldn't protect against an enemy that could see in the dark. The ASV Mark II radar sets that equipped the Black Cats had originally been developed by the British, with Dr. Edward Bowen's team at the Royal Aircraft Establishment creating the system that operated on a wavelength that seemed impossibly short to Japanese scientists who had examined captured equipment and declared it useless propaganda, not understanding that the Allies had made breakthrough advances in microwave technology that Japan's electronics industry focused entirely on copying German designs from the 1930s couldn't match or even understand. The American version, designated ASE and manufactured by Philco Corporation, had begun reaching Pacific squadrons in late 1941, with 7,000 sets produced by mid-1943, each one capable of detecting a destroyer at 20 miles, a submarine at 10 miles if surfaced, and even individual barges at 5 miles, Ranges that seemed like fantasy to Japanese naval officers who still relied on lookouts with binoculars just as their predecessors had at Tsushima in 1905. The radar pulse, invisible and undetectable to Japanese equipment, swept across the water at the speed of light, bouncing off metal hulls and returning to the aircraft to paint a clear picture on the operator's scope. Technology that Yamada's superiors in Rabaul dismissed as impossible even as their losses mounted week after week, convoy after convoy. Lieutenant Mason watched his instrument panel as they approached the Japanese convoy. His altimeter reading 1,500 feet, low enough to ensure accuracy but high enough to avoid the light anti-aircraft guns that the Japanese mounted on their destroyers, though tonight Yamada's ships carried only supplies and exhausted soldiers being evacuated from Guadalcanal, men who had survived 2 months of starvation and American artillery only to face death from an enemy they couldn't see coming. The Black Cat operations had begun in earnest after VP-11 arrived in the Solomons in December 1942. Though experimental radar-equipped Catalinas had been hunting Japanese ships since August, their early successes dismissed by Japanese intelligence as lucky accidents, not recognizing the pattern that would soon devastate their supply lines throughout the Pacific. The paint scheme that gave the Black Cats their name wasn't just matte black but a special mixture of lamp black and soap that absorbed light so effectively that even on moonlit nights the aircraft were essentially invisible until they were directly overhead, by which time their bombs were already falling. Though the Japanese wouldn't understand this for months, instead reporting attacks by mysterious aircraft that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. The Catalina's crew consisted of 9 men, each one trained in the specialized techniques of night naval warfare that had evolved through painful trial and error in the months since Guadalcanal began, with early missions suffering losses when Japanese float planes from Ricotta Bay had managed to intercept them, forcing the development of new tactics that included flying at wave-top height until radar contact was made, then climbing rapidly to attack altitude while cutting engines to minimize noise. The radar operator, Ensign James Patterson, had graduated from the Navy's radar school in Pearl Harbor just 4 months earlier, part of a crash program to train thousands of operators in a technology that hadn't even existed in operational form when the war began, young men who learned to interpret the ghostly green traces on their scopes as surely as their fathers had learned to read weather patterns in cloud formations. Patterson watched the 4 distinct returns from Yamada's convoy, noting their speed at 12 knots, their course at 170 degrees true, perfect for an attack run from the northeast that would put the Catalina up-moon from the targets, using the bright tropical moonlight to silhouette the Japanese ships while keeping the aircraft invisible against the dark sky. Yamada had been promoted to lieutenant commander just 3 weeks earlier, replacing his predecessor who had been killed when destroyer Akatsuki was sunk by American cruiser gunfire during the naval battle of Guadalcanal on November 13th. One of the series of surface actions that had finally convinced Imperial Navy headquarters that the Americans had developed some form of night detection equipment, though they assumed it was infrared viewers like the Germans were developing, not understanding that radar had advanced far beyond what Japanese scientists thought possible. The losses in the November battles had been catastrophic, with 2 battleships, 1 cruiser, and 3 destroyers lost in actions where the Americans seemed to know exactly where the Japanese ships were even in complete darkness, though Admiral Yamamoto's staff attributed this to superior American night training rather than technology, unable to accept that Japan had fallen behind in the scientific race. The supply runs had to continue regardless of losses, because without them the 36,000 Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal would starve, though by December only 11,000 remained alive, the rest claimed by disease, starvation, and American firepower that seemed to grow more accurate every week as Henderson Field expanded and improved. The ASV radar wasn't the only technological advantage the Black Cats possessed, as they also carried the latest radio altimeters that allowed them to fly just 50 feet above the water on approach, magnetic anomaly detection gear that could find submerged submarines, and most importantly, secure radio systems that let them coordinate with other aircraft and surface ships, creating a web of detection that was slowly strangling Japanese operations throughout the Solomons. In the nose of Mason's Catalina, the bombardier checked his intervalometer, the device that would automatically release the bombs at the correct spacing to bracket the Japanese convoy, while in the waist blisters, gunners prepared their 50 caliber machine guns, weapons that could devastate the lightly protected Japanese barges and kill dozens of soldiers crowded on their decks. The Japanese had tried to counter the night attacks by stationing float planes at various seaplane bases throughout the Solomons, but these aircraft, mainly Mitsubishi F-1M Pete biplanes and some Aichi E-13A Jake reconnaissance planes, lacked radar and could only patrol randomly, occasionally getting lucky when they spotted a Catalina silhouetted against clouds or phosphorescent water. Radio Tokyo's broadcasts about the mysterious losses had grown increasingly desperate by late 1942, with announcers claiming that the Americans had developed aircraft that could fly at 500 miles per hour and turn on a dime. Propaganda meant to explain to the Japanese public why their navy could no longer protect its own supply lines, though the truth was far simpler and more devastating that slow, vulnerable flying boats equipped with British-invented radar were hunting Japanese ships with near impunity. The actual losses were staggering, with one Black Cat squadron VP-11 claiming 75,000 tons of shipping sunk by December 1944, including a cruiser, a destroyer, and multiple tankers, though these numbers were actually conservative as many damaged ships that limped back to Rabaul were written off as constructive total losses. The psychological impact was even greater than the physical losses, as Japanese destroyer captains who had once raced through the slot with confidence now approached every mission with dread, knowing that at any moment bombs could fall from an empty sky, their first warning the explosion that tore their ship apart. Admiral Tanaka himself had experienced the terror of Black Cat attacks. His flagship Naganami near missed so many times that he had transferred his flag to destroyer Teruzuki, only to have that ship torpedoed and sunk by American PT boats on December 12, 1942. Tanaka himself wounded by shrapnel, ending the career of the officer the Americans had nicknamed Tenacious Tanaka for his determination to push supplies through regardless of losses. The replacement commanders lacked Tanaka's skill and experience, leading to even higher losses as they tried to maintain the supply runs with diminishing resources, while American strength grew steadily with new squadrons of Black Cats arriving from training bases in California and Florida, where thousands of crew members were learning the specialized skills of night maritime patrol. The Catalina production lines at Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego and Canadian Vickers in Montreal were producing dozens of aircraft per month, each one immediately modified with the latest radar and electronic equipment, while Japanese aircraft production focused on fighters and bombers, with no comparable maritime patrol aircraft in development or even contemplated. Lieutenant Mason's bombardier announced 60 seconds to release over the intercom, while Patterson made final adjustments to the radar picture, ensuring they were lined up perfectly on the Japanese convoy, which continued steaming south in complete ignorance of the death approaching from above, Yamada perhaps drinking tea on his bridge, perhaps reviewing the evacuation schedule for the soldiers they were to pick up at Cape Esperance. Certainly not scanning the sky for an aircraft he couldn't hear over his ship's engines and couldn't see against the star-filled Pacific night. The British had pioneered this type of attack in the Bay of Biscay against German U-boats, where Wing Commander Humphrey de Verde Lee had developed the Lee light system that worked in conjunction with ASV radar, illuminating submarines at the last moment before attack. Though the Pacific Black Cats had found that moonlight and the phosphorescence of tropical waters usually provided enough illumination without betraying their position with artificial lights. The German U-boats had at least possessed the METOX radar detector, which could pick up the 15-meter wavelength of the ASV Mark II, giving them some warning of approaching aircraft, though this advantage disappeared in March 1943 when the Allies introduced centimetric radar operating at wavelengths the METOX couldn't detect, leading to the slaughter of Black May when 41 U-boats were lost in 30 days. The Japanese had nothing comparable to METOX, their electronics industry having focused on copying German technology from the 1930s rather than developing indigenous capabilities, leaving their ships completely blind to radar emissions that were painting them as clearly as searchlights would have, though Admiral Yamamoto's staff in Truk continued to insist that the losses were due to American submarines or mines rather than aircraft, unable to accept that their vaunted night fighting capabilities had been made obsolete by technology they didn't understand. The few Japanese scientists who had examined captured radar equipment, including parts from a crashed B-17 on Guadalcanal, had dismissed it as too heavy and complex for practical use, not understanding that the Americans were mass-producing thousands of sets and training tens of thousands of operators, creating a technological advantage that would only grow as the war progressed. The Italian Regia Marina had experienced similar bewilderment when British radar-directed naval gunfire had devastated their fleet at Cape Matapan in March 1941. Admiral Angelo Iachino writing afterward that the battle had revealed our inferiority in effective aero-naval cooperation and the backwardness of our night battle technology, though even this admission came too late to develop countermeasures before Italy's surrender in 1943. Mason pushed his control yoke forward slightly, beginning the attack dive as Patterson called out the range, 2 miles bearing steady. While the bombardier made final adjustments to his sight, compensating for the light crosswind that weather reconnaissance had reported earlier, another American advantage as the Japanese had no comparable weather service in the Solomons, relying on observations from their scattered garrisons that were often days out of date. The convoy below continued its steady course, for destroyers shepherding 8 barges in 2 columns, each barge carrying 50 tons of supplies and 30 soldiers. Men who had survived the hell of Guadalcanal only to face death from an enemy that technology had made invisible and omniscient. The ASV radar had evolved from British experiments in the late 1930s, when Robert Watson Watt's team had realized that the same radio waves used to detect aircraft could be adapted for maritime patrol. Though early sets were so primitive that operators joked they could barely distinguish between a battleship and a whale, problems solved by the cavity magnetron that allowed much shorter wavelengths and better resolution. The cavity magnetron itself was perhaps the most important technological development of the war, a British invention that the Tizard mission had brought to America in September 1940, a device so revolutionary that American scientists had initially refused to believe it could work, generating powerful microwaves from a device the size of a fist, enabling radar sets small enough to fit in aircraft yet powerful enough to detect ships at dozens of miles. The Japanese had captured a cavity magnetron from a crashed RAF bomber in the Dutch East Indies in early 1943, but their scientists couldn't understand its principles or reproduce its manufacture, lacking the industrial infrastructure and theoretical knowledge that the Americans and British had developed through massive research programs employing thousands of scientists and engineers. The production of magnetrons at Western Electric and Raytheon had reached thousands per month by late 1942, each one enabling another radar set that gave Allied forces the ability to see in the dark, while Japanese forces remained limited to what human eyes could detect, a disadvantage that grew more catastrophic with each passing month. "Bombs away," the bombardier announced calmly, and Mason felt the Catalina lift slightly as 4,000 pounds of high explosives left the bomb bay, beginning their 20-second fall toward Yamada's convoy, which maintained its course, the lookouts perhaps scanning the horizon for American PT boats but never thinking to look directly overhead for an aircraft they couldn't hear over their own engines and ship noises. The bombs were standard American Mark II 500-pounders, filled with TNT and equipped with both impact and hydrostatic fuses that would detonate whether they hit a ship directly or landed in the water nearby, the underwater explosion often more damaging than a direct hit as it could break a destroyer's keel or crush the thin hulls of the barges like paper. The attack technique had been refined through dozens of missions, with crews learning that a shallow dive from 2,000 feet gave the best combination of accuracy and survivability, as Japanese anti-aircraft fire, limited to 25mm and 13mm guns on most destroyers, was ineffective above 1,500 feet at night when gunners couldn't see their tracers clearly enough to correct their aim. The first bomb struck the water 10 meters from destroyer Naganami's port side, the hydrostatic fuse detonating at a depth of 8 feet, sending a column of water higher than the ship's mast while the shock wave cracked hull plates and shattered gauges in the engine room, though Yamada wouldn't know the extent of the damage for several minutes as damage reports filtered up from below. The second bomb hit a barge directly, the wooden vessel disappearing in a flash of light and smoke, taking all 30 soldiers and crew with it, while the third and fourth bombs bracketed another destroyer, Kawakaze, causing flooding in 2 compartments and jamming her rudder 15 degrees to starboard, forcing her to circle helplessly while her damaged control parties struggled to regain steering control. The Black Cat was already climbing away, Mason pushing the throttles forward to military power as Patterson reported all bombs on target, while the waist gunners strafed the surviving barges with 50 caliber fire, the tracers looking like strings of burning pearls connecting the aircraft to the ships below, each bullet capable of punching through the thin wooden hulls and killing men packed in the holds. The Japanese anti-aircraft fire, when it finally came, was wild and undisciplined, streams of tracers arcing into empty sky as gunners fired at where they thought the aircraft might be, having only the sound of engines to guide them, not realizing the Catalina was already 2 miles away and climbing through 3,000 feet, heading for another radar contact Patterson had spotted to the east, possibly more barges trying to sneak through while the convoy attracted attention. Yamada ordered his radio operator to transmit a contact report to Rabaul. Under air attack, position 70 miles northwest Cape Esperance, 2 ships damaged, 1 barge destroyed. Though he didn't mention that he had never seen the attacking aircraft, an omission that would be repeated in dozens of similar reports as destroyer captains were reluctant to admit they were being hunted by an invisible enemy. The surviving barges scattered, their skippers knowing that staying together only made them easier targets. Though they didn't know that the radar could track them individually, each small wooden vessel returning enough signal for the skilled operators to vector in other Black Cats that were already airborne from their base at Henderson Field. VP-11 had arrived in the Solomons with 12 PBY-5A amphibians, though by January 1943 they were down to 7 operational aircraft, the others lost to Japanese float planes, operational accidents, and simple wear and tear from flying 15-hour missions in tropical conditions that corroded metal and rotted fabric faster than maintenance crews could repair them. The squadron's commander, Lieutenant Commander Frank O'Brien, had instituted a rotation system where each crew flew every third night, giving them time to recover from the exhaustion of all-night missions while maintaining continuous pressure on Japanese supply efforts, though even this schedule was pushing men to their limits. The radar operators suffered particularly badly, spending entire missions staring at the green phosphorescent scope in a darkened compartment, emerging after landing with splitting headaches and vision problems that the flight surgeons called radar operator's eye, though no one was excused from flying unless they were physically unable to climb into the aircraft. The German experience in the Bay of Biscay provided a chilling parallel to what the Japanese were experiencing in the Solomons, as Admiral Karl Donitz's U-boats had gone from near invulnerability in night surface transits to suffering catastrophic losses when RAF Coastal Command introduced centimetric radar in March 1943, technology that the German METOX detectors couldn't sense, leading to U-boats being attacked without warning just as Japanese ships were being ambushed in the Pacific. The Germans had at least understood that they were being detected by radar and had rushed development of the Naxos detector that could pick up centimetric wavelengths, though it didn't reach operational units until September 1943, by which time the U-boat force had been effectively defeated in the Atlantic, while the Japanese continued to deny that radar was responsible for their losses, instead blaming spies, code breaking, or simple bad luck. The Italian Regia Marina had suffered similar technological blindness, with only 12 warships equipped with the indigenous EC-3 Turgufo radar by spring 1943, 5 months before Italy's surrender. Admiral Iacchino later writing that the fleet's lack of radar had been catastrophic and had contributed directly to defeats at Cape Matapan and in numerous convoy battles where British radar-directed gunfire had proven devastatingly accurate. Mason's Catalina continued hunting through the night, Patterson picking up another contact at 15 miles, what appeared to be a single large vessel moving at high speed, possibly a destroyer racing back to Rabaul with wounded from the earlier attack, though it could also be one of the fast cruiser mine layers the Japanese had been using to seed fields around Allied bases. The Black Cat turned to intercept, descending to 500 feet to get below any radar the Japanese might have, though this was unnecessary as the vessel, destroyer Yagi, had no electronic detection equipment beyond a primitive radio direction finder that could sometimes pick up American voice transmissions if operators forgot communication security and transmitted in clear. The Japanese had actually captured intact ASV sets from crashed aircraft, including a complete installation from AB-17 that had landed on Bougainville, but their scientists couldn't understand the principle of operation or reproduce the precision manufacturing required for the magnetron and other components, leaving their forces as blind in 1943 as they had been at the war's start. The attack on Yagi followed the same pattern, a radar-guided approach from down moon, a climb to attack altitude, and a diving run that put 4 bombs in a perfect string along the destroyer's track, though only one hit directly, blowing off her stern and leaving her dead in the water while Mason's gunners strafed her bridge in gun positions, killing most of the officers including her captain, Commander Shermai Goro, whose last radio transmission was cut off mid-sentence as .50 caliber. Bullets shattered the radio room. The Black Cats weren't just hunting ships but were part of a coordinated campaign to strangle Japanese forces on Guadalcanal and throughout the Solomons, working with coast watchers hidden on islands throughout the region who reported Japanese ship movements, allowing the Catalinas to be vectored onto targets that might otherwise have slipped through in the vast expanses of ocean. The coast watchers, mainly Australian military personnel and civilian volunteers, had been warning of Japanese air raids since the campaign began, but by late 1942 they were also coordinating with the Black Cats, providing real-time intelligence that multiplied the effectiveness of the radar-equipped aircraft. The mathematics of attrition were inexorable, with Japanese losses in the Solomons reaching unsustainable levels by December 1942, forcing the Imperial General Headquarters to begin planning for evacuation of Guadalcanal, though they couldn't admit even to themselves that they were retreating from what they had once called the decisive battleground of the Pacific War. The Tokyo Express had delivered approximately 30,000 troops to Guadalcanal between August and December 1942, but fewer than 11,000 were evacuated in February 1943, the rest dead from combat, disease, and starvation, while the ships attempting to supply them had suffered losses that the Imperial Navy could never replace. The destroyer force that had been the pride of the Imperial Navy, with their superior Type 93 long lance torpedoes and intensive night fighting training, had been reduced from over 40 first-line destroyers to fewer than 20 operational vessels, many of those damaged and requiring extended repairs that Japan's overtaxed shipyards couldn't provide quickly. The impact of the Black Cat operations extended far beyond simple tonnage figures, as the psychological effect on Japanese morale was devastating, with sailors speaking in hushed tones about the curse of the black planes that could see in the dark, while soldiers waiting for evacuation from Guadalcanal preferred to take their chances in the jungle rather than board ships that might be attacked by an enemy they couldn't see or fight. Radio Tokyo continued to broadcast increasingly desperate propaganda about wonder weapons and secret aircraft, but Japanese naval officers knew the truth, that they were being hunted by technology they didn't possess and couldn't counter, a reversal of the technological superiority they had enjoyed in 1941 when their oxygen-powered torpedoes and superior optics had given them advantages in night combat. The long lance torpedo that had devastated Allied naval forces at Savo Island and other early battles was useless against an enemy that attacked from the air without warning, while the intensive night training that Japanese destroyer crews had undergone for years meant nothing when bombs fell from an empty sky. Lieutenant Mason checked his fuel gauges, showing they had enough for another 2 hours of patrol before heading back to Henderson Field, where ground crews would immediately refuel and rearm the Catalina for another crew to take out at dusk, maintaining the relentless pressure that was slowly strangling Japanese forces throughout the Solomons. The aircraft itself was a marvel of American industrial production, built by Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego with components from dozens of suppliers across the country, each PBY-5A costing approximately $90,000 and requiring 11,000 man-hours to construct, though by 1943 production had been streamlined to the point where a complete aircraft rolled off the assembly line every few hours. The radar installation alone represented thousands of hours of research and development, from the theoretical work at MIT's Radiation Laboratory to the production engineering at Western Electric and Philco, creating a technological advantage that multiplied the effectiveness of every aircraft and ship equipped with it. The Japanese response to the crisis had been too little and too late, with development of their own radar systems proceeding slowly due to lack of resources and theoretical understanding, while their military leadership continued to believe that spiritual superiority and warrior tradition could overcome technological disadvantages, a delusion that would persist until the atomic bombs finally forced acknowledgement of scientific reality. The Type 22 radar that began appearing on Japanese ships in late 1943 had a maximum range of 35 kilometers and poor resolution, essentially equivalent to what the British had deployed in 1940, leaving Japanese forces 3 years behind in the electronic war that was determining the outcome of naval battles. The Germans had offered to provide technical assistance and even complete radar sets through submarine delivery, but only a handful arrived before Germany's surrender, and Japanese engineers couldn't adapt the German designs to their different industrial capabilities and requirements. Patterson reported another contact, multiple small returns that indicated a group of barges trying to sneak through close to the coast of New Georgia, using the land return to mask their radar signature, a tactic that might have worked against less experienced operators but was obvious to men who had been hunting ships for months and could distinguish between the steady return of land and the moving blips of vessels. The barges were the Japanese answer to the losses of destroyers, smaller targets that could be produced quickly and cheaply, though they were even more vulnerable to air attack with no anti-aircraft weapons and maximum speeds of only 8 knots, making them easy targets for any aircraft that found them. The shift from destroyers to barges represented not just a tactical change but an admission of defeat, as the Imperial Navy could no longer risk its valuable warships in waters dominated by American air power. Both the land-based aircraft from Henderson Field and the carrier groups that were increasingly operating in the Solomons. The attack on the barge group was almost anticlimactic, Mason diving from only 1,000 feet while the gunners strafed with both 50 caliber machine guns and the 20mm cannon that some Black Cats had mounted in the nose, the barges literally disintegrating under the concentrated fire while their passengers, soldiers being evacuated from New Georgia, jumped into the water where most would drown or be taken by sharks, the waters of the Solomons having become a feeding ground for predators drawn by the constant battles. The Japanese soldiers had been told they were being evacuated to fight another day, but most knew they were simply postponing the inevitable, as American forces grew stronger every day while Japan's ability to project power diminished with each lost ship and aircraft. The evacuation itself, Operation KE, conducted in February 1943, had been successful in removing 10,000 soldiers from Guadalcanal, but it represented the first strategic retreat in Japanese military history, a psychological blow from which the imperial forces would never recover. By early 1943, the Black Cat squadrons had refined their tactics to near perfection, with multiple aircraft coordinating attacks on Japanese convoys, one Catalina illuminating targets with flares while others attacked from different directions, overwhelming the limited anti-aircraft defenses and ensuring that even if some ships escaped, others would be damaged or sunk. VP-12 had joined VP-11 in the Solomons by December 1942, doubling the number of Black Cats available for operations, while VP-51 and VP-91 were preparing to deploy from training bases in Florida, where crews practiced night attack techniques over the Gulf of Mexico, dropping practice bombs on target sleds towed by obsolete destroyers. The training program had been expanded dramatically after the early successes in the Solomons, with the Navy recognizing that night maritime patrol represented a revolution in naval warfare as significant as the introduction of aircraft carriers, allowing control of sea lanes that had previously been conceded to the enemy during darkness. The German U-boat forces' experience in the Bay of Biscay provided both validation and warning for the Black Cat operations, as RAF Coastal Command's introduction of centimetric radar in March 1943 had led to the devastating losses of Black May, when 41 U-boats were lost in a single month, forcing Admiral Donitz to withdraw from the convoy routes and essentially concede defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic. The German response had been to develop the Naxos radar detector that could sense centimetric wavelengths, though it didn't reach operational units until September 1943, too late to prevent the collapse of the U-boat campaign, while also rushing development of the Type 21 submarine that could operate entirely submerged, eliminating the vulnerability to radar detection. The Japanese had no comparable response, lacking both the technical capability to develop radar detectors and the industrial capacity to build new types of submarines or surface vessels that could counter the Allied technological advantage, leaving them to continue suffering losses that grew worse as American radar technology improved and more Black Cat squadrons arrived in theater. The Italian experience in the Mediterranean provided another parallel, as the Regia Marina had discovered at Cape Matapan in March 1941 that their lack of radar left them helpless against British forces that could track and engage them in complete darkness, resulting in the loss of 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers in a single night, casualties that effectively ended Italian attempts to challenge British control of the eastern Mediterranean. Admiral Iachino had written after the battle that it had revealed the backwardness of our night battle technology. But this recognition came too late for Italy to develop effective countermeasures before the armistice in September 1943, by which time only 12 Italian warships had been equipped with the indigenous EC-3 Turgufo radar, a system that was already obsolete compared to Allied centimetric sets. The Italian failure to develop radar had multiple causes, including Mussolini's belief that Italy's geographic position made it an unsinkable aircraft carrier that didn't need sophisticated technology, the rivalry between the Navy and Air Force that prevented effective cooperation, and the lack of industrial infrastructure to support advanced electronics production. Mason's Catalina continued its patrol, the radar screen now empty except for the steady returns of islands and the occasional flicker that might be a whale or floating debris, the Japanese having learned to suspend operations when the moon was bright and Black Cats were most effective, though this meant accepting even slower supply deliveries to their scattered garrisons. The crew relaxed slightly, knowing they had at least contributed to the interdiction effort, though everyone understood that tomorrow night the Japanese would try again, and the night after that, the grinding campaign of attrition continuing until one side or the other could no longer sustain the losses. The mathematics favored the Americans, with their massive industrial production and growing technological advantages, but the cost in human terms was still significant, with Black Cat squadrons suffering steady losses to operational accidents, mechanical failures, and the occasional interception by Japanese night fighters, though these were rare as the Japanese had not developed effective airborne radar for their night fighters. The Japanese had actually attempted to develop their own night attack capability, with the Imperial Navy forming special units equipped with Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers painted black and trained in night torpedo attacks. But without radar, these aircraft were limited to attacking ships silhouetted against the moon or illuminated by flares, tactics that made them vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire and achieving minimal success compared to the devastation wreaked by the Black Cats. The fundamental problem was that Japan had entered the war with a tactical doctrine based on decisive battle, expecting a single climactic engagement like Tsushima that would determine the outcome, not understanding that modern war would be determined by industrial production and technological innovation rather than warrior spirit and tactical skill. The Black Cats represented exactly the kind of grinding, attritional warfare that Japan was least prepared to fight, using mass-produced technology to achieve strategic effects that no amount of courage or training could counter. The radar technology that enabled the Black Cat operations continued to evolve rapidly, with the introduction of the ASV Mark II in early 1943 providing centimetric wavelengths that gave even better resolution and were completely undetectable by any Japanese equipment, though by this time the Japanese had largely abandoned large-scale surface operations in the Solomons, conceding control of the waters to American forces. The Mark III sets used the cavity magnetron to generate 10-centimeter waves at 50 kilowatts of power, providing returns so clear that operators could distinguish between different types of ships and even count individual barges in a convoy, capabilities that would have seemed like magic to the Japanese lookouts straining their eyes into the darkness. The production of these sets had been prioritized after the success of the early Black Cat operations, with Western Electric and Raytheon producing hundreds per month, each one destined for aircraft or ships that would multiply Allied advantages in the Pacific. Lieutenant Mason began the turn back toward Henderson Field as fuel reached the predetermined minimum, while Patterson made final sweeps with the radar to ensure no targets had been missed, the routine of another successful mission that had added to the growing tally of Japanese losses that would eventually force their complete withdrawal from the Solomons. The crew was exhausted after 8 hours of flying, the constant vigilance required for night operations draining even experienced aviators, while the strain of knowing that any mechanical failure over water meant almost certain death added psychological pressure that accumulated over multiple missions. The Black Cat crews developed their own culture and traditions, painting elaborate nose art on their aircraft despite regulations against it, creating squadron songs that celebrated their nocturnal hunting, and developing a reputation as the mavericks of naval aviation, operating independently in conditions that other aviators considered suicidal. The impact of the Black Cat operations extended throughout the Pacific as other squadrons adopted similar tactics, with VP-52 claiming 34,000 tons of merchant shipping and 10,000 tons of warships destroyed by the end of 1943, while VP-63, operating in the Central Pacific, pioneered the use of magnetic anomaly detection equipment to hunt submarines, though this proved less effective than radar against surface vessels. The cumulative effect of all Black Cat operations was staggering, with estimates of total Japanese shipping destroyed ranging from 157,000 tons for single squadrons to over 28 million tons for all squadrons combined. Losses that Japan's limited shipbuilding industry could never replace while also trying to maintain naval construction and repair battle damage. The psychological impact was equally significant, as Japanese sailors began refusing assignments to supply runs, knowing that they might be attacked without warning by an enemy they couldn't see or fight, while soldiers on isolated garrisons watched their supplies dwindle knowing that ships attempting to reach them were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. The German parallel continued to provide lessons, as the Kriegsmarine's introduction of the Naxos detector in September 1943 had temporarily reduced losses in the Bay of Biscay, but the Allies had responded by introducing the ASV Mark VI with power attenuators that allowed operators to reduce emissions as they approached targets, giving the impression the aircraft was flying away while actually closing for attack. The technological race between detection and counter-detection continued throughout the war, with each side developing new capabilities and countermeasures, though the Allies' superior industrial base and research infrastructure meant they could introduce innovations faster than the Axis could respond to them. The Japanese were not even participants in this race, having fallen so far behind in electronics technology that they couldn't understand captured equipment, much less develop countermeasures, leaving their forces increasingly vulnerable as Allied capabilities improved. The approach to Henderson Field required careful navigation, as the airstrip was blacked out to avoid attracting Japanese bombers, with only minimal lighting activated when aircraft were actually landing, forcing pilots to rely on dead reckoning and radio beacons to find their base after hours of patrol over featureless ocean. Mason called the tower for landing clearance, receiving approval to enter the pattern behind another Black Cat that had suffered engine damage from anti-aircraft fire and was limping home on one engine, a common occurrence as the Japanese gradually improved their anti-aircraft defenses even if they couldn't detect the attacking aircraft. The landing itself was routine, the Catalina's boat hull allowing it to handle the rough coral runway that destroyed tires on conventional aircraft, though the constant operations were taking their toll on the aircraft with corrosion, fatigue cracks, and worn engines reducing availability rates to barely 50%. Ground crews immediately swarmed over the aircraft as it shut down, refueling from drums, loading fresh bombs, checking fluid levels, and patching the inevitable holes from small arms fire, preparing it for another crew that would take off at dusk to continue the relentless pressure on Japanese supply lines. The maintenance chiefs performed miracles keeping the aircraft flying, cannibalizing wrecked Catalinas for spare parts, improvising repairs with whatever materials were available, and nursing worn engines well past their recommended overhaul periods. Understanding that every night a Black Cat didn't fly meant Japanese supplies might get through to sustain enemy resistance. The radar technicians were particularly valuable, the only personnel who understood the complex electronic systems that gave the Black Cats their advantage, working through the tropical heat to repair and calibrate equipment that had never been designed for such harsh conditions. Mason's crew debriefed with intelligence officers, reporting the ships attacked, positions, and estimated damage, information that would be correlated with Coast Watcher reports and radio intercepts to build a picture of Japanese operations that grew more complete and depressing for the enemy with each passing week. The intelligence system supporting the Black Cats was sophisticated and comprehensive, including ultra-intercepts of Japanese radio traffic. Though the crews weren't told about this source, Coast Watcher reports from throughout the islands, submarine sightings, and even information from captured Japanese soldiers who revealed supply schedules and routes under interrogation. The Americans had achieved information dominance to match their technological superiority, knowing when and where Japanese ships would sail while the enemy operated in intelligence darkness, sending ships into waters they thought were empty but were actually patrolled by multiple Black Cats guided by radar and intelligence to their targets. By February 1943, when the Japanese conducted Operation KE to evacuate the remnants of their forces from Guadalcanal, the Black Cats had become so effective that the evacuation had to be conducted by destroyers racing at maximum speed through the slot, accepting mechanical damage from the strain rather than risk slower passages that would guarantee interception by radar-equipped aircraft. Even with these precautions, several destroyers were damaged during the evacuation, including Naganami, which suffered near misses that opened hull plates and flooded compartments, forcing her to limp back to truck for repairs that would take months in Japan's overtaxed shipyards. The evacuation itself was considered successful by Japanese standards, removing 10,000 soldiers from certain death or capture, but it represented the abandonment of what had been declared the decisive battleground of the Pacific War, a strategic defeat that no amount of propaganda could disguise. Rear Admiral Tanaka, recovering from wounds suffered when his flagship was torpedoed, wrote privately that the American night aircraft had made traditional destroyer operations impossible, forcing the adoption of barge transport that was inadequate for supplying major forces, essentially conceding that technology had trumped the tactical superiority the Imperial Navy had spent decades developing. His replacement commanders lacked his skill and experience, leading to even higher losses as they tried to maintain supply runs with diminishing resources and growing American opposition that now included PT boats guided to targets by Black Cats, creating a coordinated defense that left no safe passages through the Solomons. The Tokyo Express effectively ceased operations after the Guadalcanal evacuation, with subsequent supply efforts limited to submarines and fast destroyer runs to the most important garrisons, accepting that isolated forces would have to survive on their own or be abandoned. The German experience in the Atlantic provided a preview of what awaited Japan, as Admiral Donitz had been forced to withdraw U-boats from the convoy routes after the catastrophic losses of spring 1943, writing in his war diary that the enemy has rendered the U-boat war impossible through radar, an admission that technology had defeated the tactical excellence of his submarine force. The development of centimetric radar had been the decisive factor, operating at wavelengths that German detectors couldn't sense until the Naxos system was rushed into production, by which time the U-boats had suffered irreplaceable losses in experienced crews and were forced to adopt defensive tactics that eliminated their effectiveness as commerce raiders. The Japanese faced the same technological defeat but without even the limited countermeasures the Germans developed, leaving their forces to suffer steady attrition until they could no longer maintain effective operations. The Italian Regia Marina's experience at Cape Matapan had provided an even earlier warning that should have alerted all Axis powers to the danger of radar, when British battleships guided by radar had devastated an Italian squadron in night action, sinking 3 heavy cruisers with minimal British losses, demonstrating that traditional optical range-finding and star shell illumination were obsolete against radar-directed gunfire. Admiral Iachino's after-action report had explicitly stated that the battle revealed Italian backwardness in night battle technology. But this warning had been ignored by both German and Japanese naval leadership who believed their own night fighting capabilities were superior to Italy's, not understanding that technology had made tactical skill irrelevant. The Italian development of the EC-3 Turgu-4 radar had begun after Matapan, but proceeded slowly due to limited resources and lack of theoretical understanding, with only 12 ships equipped by the time of Italy's surrender, too few and too late to effect operations. The Black Cat operations continued to expand through 1943 and into 1944, with new squadrons arriving as fast as they could be trained and equipped, while improved radar systems and weapons made each aircraft more lethal than its predecessors. The introduction of the ASV Mark VI with its attenuated power settings made detection by enemy radar warning receivers nearly impossible, even though the Japanese never developed such receivers, while new weapons including 5-inch rockets and acoustic homing torpedoes gave the Catalinas additional ways to attack enemy vessels. By mid-1943, VP-11 alone had been credited with sinking 75,000 tons of shipping including a cruiser, destroyer, and multiple tankers, earning the first Presidential Unit Citation awarded to a patrol squadron, recognition of the decisive impact these slow, ungainly flying boats had achieved through technological superiority. The Japanese response remained limited to tactical adaptations rather than technological solutions, with convoys traveling only during bad weather when Black Cats were less effective, unloading supplies in drums that could be thrown overboard quickly if attacked, and eventually abandoning surface transport entirely in favor of submarines that could at least travel submerged during daylight, though they were still vulnerable to radar detection when surfaced at night to charge batteries. The development of Japanese radar proceeded slowly, with the Type 22 surface search sets that began appearing in late 1943 being essentially copies of German designs from 1940, already obsolete when they entered service and completely inadequate against centimetric radar that was standard on all Allied aircraft by that time. The few Japanese scientists who understood the magnitude of the technological gap were ignored by military leaders who continued to believe that spiritual superiority could overcome material disadvantages, a delusion that would persist until the atomic bombs finally demonstrated the decisive importance of scientific advancement. The broader impact of the Black Cat operations extended beyond simple interdiction of supplies, as the constant losses forced the Japanese to divert resources from offensive operations to convoy protection, with destroyers that should have been screening carrier task forces instead shepherding supply barges, while the cream of Japanese naval aviation was attrited in futile attempts to protect convoys from night attack. The psychological impact on Japanese morale was devastating, with sailors and soldiers developing an almost superstitious dread of the black planes that hunted them through the darkness, spreading stories of aircraft that could see through clouds and darkness, that appeared from nowhere and vanished just as mysteriously, that seemed to know exactly where Japanese ships would be before they even sailed. Radio Tokyo's propaganda became increasingly desperate, inventing stories of wonder weapons and secret aircraft to explain the losses. But the truth was simpler and more devastating, that American industry and science had produced a technological advantage that Japanese forces could neither match nor counter. The lessons of the Black Cat operations would influence naval warfare for generations, demonstrating that control of the electromagnetic spectrum was as important as control of the sea itself, that technology could multiply the effectiveness of forces beyond what numbers alone would suggest, and that industrial capacity to produce advanced weapons was more decisive than tactical skill or warrior tradition. The radar systems that enabled the Black Cats were the ancestors of modern naval sensors, while the tactics developed for night maritime patrol would be refined and passed on to future generations of naval aviators who would hunt submarines with sonobuoys and magnetic anomaly detectors that traced their lineage directly to the equipment carried by the Catalinas. The integration of intelligence, reconnaissance, and strike capabilities that the Black Cats pioneered would become the foundation of modern naval aviation, with information dominance recognized as the key to victory in conventional warfare. As the war progressed into 1944 and 1945, the Black Cat's role evolved from interdiction to reconnaissance and rescue, with the Japanese surface fleet essentially eliminated as an effective force and supply operations reduced to submarines and occasional fast destroyer runs to the most critical bases. The squadrons that had hunted ships now searched for downed aircrew, guided by the same radar that had once directed them to enemy vessels, saving hundreds of Allied aviators who would have otherwise perished in the vast Pacific. The last Black Cat mission was flown in February 1945, marking the end of an era in naval aviation, though the lessons learned and technology developed would continue to influence military operations for decades to come. The Japanese never developed an effective counter to the Black Cats, with their radar technology remaining primitive and their tactical adaptations only reducing rather than eliminating losses, leaving their forces to suffer steady attrition until they could no longer maintain effective operations in the face of overwhelming American technological and material superiority. The final Japanese radar sets produced in 1945 were still inferior to what the Allies had deployed in 1942. A 3-year gap that reflected not just industrial limitations but a fundamental failure to understand how warfare had changed. That victory would go not to the most courageous warriors but to the side that could best harness science and industry to military purposes. The Black Cats had demonstrated this truth night after night over the dark waters of the Pacific, their radar eyes seeing what human vision could not, their bombs finding targets that thought themselves safe in darkness, their success built on technology the Japanese never expected and couldn't counter. The legacy of the Black Cats extended far beyond their impressive record of ships sunk and missions completed, as they had proven that technology could provide decisive advantages in warfare, that industrial capacity to produce advanced weapons was as important as tactical skill, and that information dominance through radar and intelligence was the key to victory in modern conflict. The thousands of tons of Japanese shipping destroyed by the Black Cats represented not just tactical success but strategic victory, as the inability to supply isolated garrisons forced the Japanese to abandon positions they could no longer sustain, accelerating the Allied advance through the Pacific. The psychological impact of being hunted by an invisible enemy had broken Japanese morale more effectively than conventional combat, demonstrating that technological superiority could achieve effects beyond mere physical destruction. The parallel experiences of the German U-boat force in the Atlantic and the Italian Regia Marina in the Mediterranean had shown that all Axis powers suffered from the same technological disadvantage, unable to match Allied radar development or produce effective countermeasures in time to affect the war's outcome. The introduction of centimetric radar in 1943 had been decisive in all theaters, providing capabilities that Axis forces couldn't detect or counter, turning what had been contested waters into Allied-dominated zones where Axis vessels operated at extreme peril. The Black May of 1943, when 41 U-boats were lost in 30 days, the devastation of Italian cruisers at Cape Matapan, and the steady attrition of Japanese shipping in the Pacific were all symptoms of the same underlying reality, that the Allies had achieved technological superiority that no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome. The Black Cats themselves became legendary in naval aviation history, their crews remembered as the pioneers who had proven that slow, ungainly flying boats could become deadly ship killers when equipped with advanced technology and employed with innovative tactics. The nose art on their aircraft, depicting fierce black cats with glowing eyes and bared fangs, became iconic symbols of American naval aviation in the Pacific War, while their motto, "Through Darkness to Victory," captured the essence of their contribution to Allied success. The Presidential Unit Citation awarded to VP-11 in December 1944 recognized not just their record of ships destroyed but their role in developing and proving the tactics that would be employed by dozens of squadrons throughout the Pacific, multiplying the impact of their initial success.